Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let's begin with Story 1, From Villages to Polis, the slow birth of the Greek city-state. You begin in the rubble, not of grand temples or marble-clad courtyards, but of sun-baked huts, dugout hearths, and broken amphorae lying under centuries of dust. The Greek city-state known as the polis was not born in splendor, nor in the shouts of democratic assembly. It began in silence, in isolation, and most importantly, in forgettable routine. After the collapse of the Mycenaean palatial centers around 1100 BCE, Greece entered what modern historians blandly term the Dark Age. The term itself is an admission of ignorance. For nearly 3 centuries, the written record vanished. No new linear B tablets, no grand inscriptions, just the slow whisper of survival played out across the mountains and valleys of a fractured land. But beneath the surface, something vital was happening. The collapse in the fragment. The Mycenaeans had once ruled from hilltop citadels Mycenae, Turins, Pylos, organizing labor, tribute, and warfare through a centralized administrative structure. When those palaces fell, whether by internal dissent, sea raiders, or economic fatigue, their centralized control unraveled. Trade routes decayed. Record-keeping stopped. Monumental buildings ceased. And so did the idea of a singular authority. What replaced it was not chaos, but fragmentation. And from that fragmentation, the seeds of the polis quietly grew. In the centuries that followed, the population declined. Settlements became more dispersed. People clustered in small villages, often on defensible heights or near fresh water. These communities were modest, typically comprising just a few dozen families, but they were resilient. Daily life revolved around pastoralism. Sheep and goats were easier to tend in the hilly terrain than large-scale agriculture. Men herded, women spun wool, children helped gather kindling or graze animals. This was not a life of excitement, but it was stable. And in this dull routine, communities began to cohere not as subjects of a king, but as interdependent equals. The household as the state. In these early centuries, the oikos, the household, was the basic unit of survival and power. Authority lay in the hands of the male head of household, who not only controlled family labor, but also engaged in negotiations with other heads of households. Governance, if you could call it that, happened around shared meals or community gatherings, where disputes were settled not by decree, but by consensus or grudging tolerance. There were no magistrates, no law codes, and certainly no citizenship. Yet already there was a sense of shared obligation, defense of the herd, maintenance of sacred groves, participation in local feasts and rituals. These bonds would later crystallize into the civic duties of the polis. It is tempting to skip over these early centuries, to rush to the age of hoplites and orators, but without these foundations of shared hardship, localism, and informal governance, the Greek city-state could never have emerged. These were the crucibles of cohesion. Sacred sites and the proto-community. Religion in early Iron Age Greece was neither centralized nor ornamental. It was local, practical, and bound to the rhythms of the seasons. A shrine to Hera might be nothing more than a stone altar near a spring. A festival to Apollo consisted of offerings left by villagers in hopes of fertility or healing. But these sacred practices created nodes, points where different households, sometimes from several hamlets, gathered. These gatherings mattered. Through ritual and feast, alliances formed, elders spoke. Songs were shared that passed on not only myths but memories of past raids, good harvests, or shared suffering. In this way, disparate settlements began to think of themselves as part of something larger, a community still formless but taking shape through repetition. Some of these sacred sites would later become the Acropolis or central temple complex of future polis. Others would be forgotten, buried under later construction, but their function as communal centers paved the way for urbanization, trade, and the return of contact. By the 9th century BCE, signs of renewed trade began to emerge. Pottery styles became more uniform across regions, suggesting shared tastes or at least awareness. Iron tools began to replace bronze, which was harder to acquire without established trade routes. This shift may sound minor, but it had profound implications. Iron was more plentiful and easier to work locally. It allowed for more efficient agriculture and better weapons. Suddenly, a village could defend itself more effectively or challenge a neighbor. With trade came contact. Contact bred comparison, and comparison led to competition. Some villages began to specialize. Those near clay deposits developed pottery workshops. Others near forests became timber exporters. These microeconomies encouraged innovation and, eventually, surplus. Surplus led to inequality, and inequality required management. For the first time in centuries, some families began to rise above others not through royal claim, but through wealth and access. The emergence of the basileus. By the 8th century BCE, the figure of the basileus began to appear in both oral tradition and archaeological hints. Not quite a king, not quite a mayor, the basileus was a local leader likely chosen for his success in battle, wealth, or charisma. His authority was personal, not institutional. He presided over religious rituals, mediated disputes, and led during conflict. But unlike the Mycenaean Wanax king, the basileus had limited power. He could be challenged. His sons did not automatically inherit his role. His authority depended on continued success and the consent tacit or vocal of the leading households. In Homeric epics, these figures appear as rulers of small domains. Odysseus of Ithaca, Nestor of Pylos, Menelaus of Sparta. Whether these figures were real or composite, they reflect the political world of early polis in formation, fragmented, competitive, and personalistic. Settling the hilltops. Urbanization did not begin with sprawling cities but with the gradual clustering of households. Often, settlements moved from lowland plains to hilltops not just for defense, but for visibility. Being seen was power. The physical layout of early settlements reveals a growing sense of planning. Shared walls, common storehouses, and eventually, communal wells. These developments were not centrally mandated but arose from practical cooperation. Over time, the needs of the collective grain storage, water access, coordinated defense necessitated more structured governance. This was not yet a polis, but it was no longer a scattered village. It was a proto-urban community, aware of its boundaries, its members, and its shared identity. Early indicators of political life. By the late 8th century, inscriptions begin to appear. One famous example is the Dipylon inscription, found in Athens, which dates to around 740 BCE. It is short a drinking prize, written in the new Greek alphabet, but it marks a turning point. Writing had returned. With writing came record-keeping, property disputes, dedications, and, eventually, laws. The use of the alphabet, borrowed and modified from the Phoenicians, was a quiet revolution. It democratized information. Suddenly, sacred knowledge, commercial transactions, and communal decisions could be inscribed, not just remembered. In this way, governance began to step beyond memory. And once politics escapes memory, it demands structure. Toward synocism, the drawing together. The word synocism refers to the unification of several villages into a single political entity. It is one of the final steps in the formation of a polis. In some cases, this happened peacefully through alliances, religious unions, or economic cooperation. In others, it was forced through conquest or consolidation by a dominant family or basileus. Athens is the most famous example, where the various Attic villages gradually came under a unified political structure. But similar processes happened across the Greek world from Argos to Chalcis to Rhodes. The key idea was this: local loyalties began to give way to civic identity, not family first but polis first. The old tribal lines blurred. What mattered now was where you lived, what rituals you joined, and which assembly you stood in. And so, over the course of 3 centuries, the Greek city-state did not erupt, it formed. Slowly, quietly, through decisions made around the hearth, disputes settled under olive trees, and shared cups poured at seasonal festivals. The polis did not erase the past, it organized it, preserved the memory of the oikos, the basileus, and the sacred grove, but placed them under a new banner, a new idea that the city was not just a place, it was a people. But what caused some settlements to unify while others withered into obscurity? Why did Athens flourish while Lefkandi declined? By the 8th century BCE, something was shifting in the Greek world. The scattered households of the earlier centuries, once isolated and defined by the bounds of kin and pasture, were beginning to coalesce into communities with shared identities. Not just neighbors, not just fellow worshippers, but something deeper, something more enduring. They began to think of themselves as citizens, though that word, polites, had yet to fully take shape. The polis was not a singular invention. It was a response, a slow, collective reaction to practical pressures, land disputes, trade competition, defense coordination, and population growth. And behind it all was a fundamental question: how do people govern themselves when there is no king? The physical form of the polis. The early polis varied in size, geography, and layout. Some, like Athens, spread across large plains and valleys. Others, like Corinth, huddled around a central acropolis, a defensible hilltop surrounded by increasingly structured development. What they shared was a new kind of spatial logic. Gone were the scattered settlements of the Dark Age. In their place rose urban cores, often anchored around a central meeting area, the agora. This space, open and flat, became the beating heart of civic life. Not only a marketplace, it was a stage for debate, dispute, and performance. The agora was surrounded by shrines, stoas, and eventually administrative buildings. In some polis, such as Argos and Eretria, the layout reflected concentric planning temples at the center, homes fanning outward. In others, like Chios, geography dictated an irregular shape, but all pointed toward one idea: shared space meant shared responsibility. The built environment wasn't just about convenience, it enforced interaction. You couldn't avoid your fellow citizens, not in the agora, not in the gymnasium, not at the festival procession. And that friction, slow and mundane, created political culture. Institutions without bureaucrats. The early polis lacked standing armies, permanent magistracies, or centralized archives. Instead, governance was shaped by tradition, oral precedent, and reputation. Power initially rested with aristocratic families, those who claimed descent from heroic ancestors or controlled key religious offices. These aristocrats formed councils, gerousiae, synedria, or simply councils of elders which deliberated on matters of war, justice, and sacred rites. Their authority was not absolute. They operated by consensus, and their reputations were often fragile. A misjudged ruling could lead to popular backlash or exile. In some cases, arbitration replaced outright violence. In others, rival aristocrats simply fought duels or mobilized their kin groups. To outsiders, this may seem chaotic, but it was a remarkably stable system for a time. It allowed communities to make collective decisions without codified law or written constitutions. Rule depended on memory, custom, and public agreement. It also depended on a deeply conservative instinct, the desire not to be ruled by one man. Oral law and the rise of legal consciousness. As polis matured, disputes became more complex. Who had access to the spring? How should tribute be divided after a raid? What compensation was owed for a trampled barley field? These questions, mundane as they seem, pushed communities toward greater legal awareness. At first, these laws were not written. They were recited by elders, priests, or designated rememberers who specialized in oral precedent. The function of these laws was not to innovate but to reinforce. But oral law had limits. It could be manipulated, forgotten, or challenged. By the mid-7th century BCE, some polis began to inscribe laws on stone or bronze. These early codes were practical, not philosophical. The Gorton Code in Crete, one of the earliest surviving examples, is a good case. Its clauses cover inheritance, adoption, sexual assault, and property rights, all in stark, minimal prose. The very act of writing laws down was revolutionary. It meant that authority no longer resided in memory or class status. It could be consulted, debated, challenged. It also meant governance began to detach from the individual. Rule became institutional. Colonization, exporting the polis model. Between 750 and 600 BCE, Greek communities launched an unprecedented wave of colonization. This was not imperial expansion in the later Roman sense, but rather the founding of new polis, autonomous settlements in Sicily, southern Italy, the Black Sea coast, and even North Africa. Why did they leave? Several reasons emerge: overpopulation, political dissent, land hunger, trade opportunity. But the key is that when these colonists founded new cities, they replicated the polis model. They brought with them the idea of communal space, shared identity, and collective governance. Each colony established its own agora, temples, and governing councils. They used similar rituals of foundation sacrifices, boundary stones, oaths of loyalty. Some retained ties to their mother cities, metropolis, but most were functionally independent. This diaspora of the polis form reinforced its legitimacy. The model traveled well because it worked. It adapted. It created order without monarchy. But it also created friction, especially when new polis clashed with indigenous populations or rival Greek cities. And that friction returned home. The problem of wealth and the rise of tyranny. As polis prospered, inequality grew. Land ownership became concentrated in fewer hands. Small farmers, once the backbone of the early polis, found themselves in debt, often pledging their freedom or their children's as collateral. At the same time, trade expanded. A new class of merchants and artisans emerged, wealthy but excluded from political power. They resented the old aristocratic monopolies and began to seek change. In this environment, a new figure appeared: the tyrannos. Unlike the modern usage, early Greek tyrants were not necessarily cruel or unlawful. They were often popular leaders who broke aristocratic control, sometimes with citizen support, sometimes by force. They promised land reform, debt relief, and order. Some, like Cypselus of Corinth, ruled for decades and left behind peaceful transitions. But tyranny was a paradox. It offered a solution to aristocratic dysfunction, yet it violated the deep-seated Greek suspicion of one-man rule. Most tyrannies were short-lived. They paved the way for broader participation in governance, but often through abrupt and disruptive means. Still, the tyrant revealed something crucial. The people could choose new forms of rule. Authority was not fixed. Identity and belonging in the early polis. What did it mean to belong to a polis? It wasn't just about where you lived. It was about ritual, memory, and obligation. Citizenship in early polis was tightly restricted. One had to be male, freeborn, and descended from citizen parents. Women were included in religious life, but excluded from political decision-making. Slaves, foreigners medics, and landless laborers were present but peripheral. Yet even within these boundaries, a powerful civic identity took shape. Through festivals, processions, military training, and religious rites, citizens performed their membership. They dressed alike in battle. They honored the same ancestors. They shared in sacred meals. These actions created what anthropologists might call imagined community. You might not know every citizen, but you trusted they would show up when the walls were threatened or when a new law was debated. This sense of identity wasn't natural, it was cultivated, and like all identities, it had limits. The slow invention of democracy's tools. Though democracy would not fully emerge until later, many of its tools were forged during this era. Assemblies. Even aristocratic polis held public gatherings where free males voiced opinions or approved decisions. These were often chaotic, loud, and swayed by oratory, but they created precedent for mass deliberation. Councils. Smaller groups of elites met regularly to handle ongoing governance, early versions of senates or boule. Magistracies. Offices began to be created for specific tasks, archon, polemarch, the smathetai, often with term limits and shared power. Lot and election. Some positions were filled by lot to reduce factionalism, others by vote. These practices reflected an evolving tension between equality and competence. These innovations were not ideological. They were responses to practical problems: how to allocate water rights, defend against raiders, resolve land disputes. But they laid the groundwork for later systems of full participation. The role of boring records and ritual. It is easy to overlook the importance of the mundane. But early polis depended on scribes, notaries, and ritual specialists who maintained consistency, who tracked who owned which field, who ensured the correct grain offering was made to Demeter, who remembered that 2 years ago an oath was sworn at the spring. These figures were not famous. They left no grand speeches, but they were essential. They provided continuity in an unstable world, and they offered something that no basileus or tyrant could guarantee: predictability. As the 7th century BCE drew to a close, the Greek world was a patchwork of polis, each with its own customs, councils, and conflicts. Yet beneath this diversity was a shared idea that a city could be governed not by decree, but by deliberation. Still, challenges loomed. What would happen when civic identity clashed with class resentment? When foreign threats demanded unified response? When the mechanisms of governance proved too slow, too brittle, or too unequal? By the mid-7th century BCE, the polis was no longer just a concept in formation. It had become a recognizable institution, a community of citizens, bound not by blood or servitude, but by shared law, ritual, and responsibility. Yet it was not a utopia. The emergence of the polis brought new pressures. Prosperity fueled inequality. Factions fractured communal trust. And across the Greek world, tensions rose. This final chapter in the formation of the polis was not built by farmers or artisans alone. It was forged through reformers, lawgivers, and, often, those we might now call revolutionaries. The tyrant problem revisited. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE saw the peak of tyranny as a political solution in many polis. These tyrants, often rising from elite ranks, seized power with popular support. They curtailed aristocratic privilege, enacted economic relief, and constructed public works to win loyalty. In Corinth, Cypselus overthrew the ruling Bacchiadi clan and governed with notable restraint. His son, Periander, expanded trade, constructed harbors, and enforced strict legal order. In Samos, Polycrates established a naval hegemony and beautified the city. Even Pisistratus in Athens, though technically a usurper, introduced festivals and infrastructure improvements. But tyranny had a built-in flaw: it was personal. Without a reliable system of succession or constitutional limitation, The death or downfall of a tyrant often led to instability or aristocratic backlash. Moreover, the very presence of a tyrant intensified debates around legitimate authority. The age of tyrants was, paradoxically, what made the rule of law seem preferable. Lawgivers and legal codification. In the wake of social conflict, some polis turned to lawgivers, figures tasked with recording, revising, or creating legal frameworks to stabilize civic life. These were not kings or tyrants, but respected citizens chosen for their wisdom, neutrality, or eloquence. Zaleucus of Locris, c. 660 BCE, was said to have created one of the first written legal codes in the Greek world, notable for its clarity and harsh punishments. Charondas of Catane in Sicily developed rules that extended citizenship rights and required magistrates to obey the same laws they enforced. Draco of Athens, c. 620 BCE, is perhaps the most infamous. His laws were written in blood, literally or metaphorically, with death as the penalty for even minor offenses. His work did not solve Athens' problems, but it did mark the moment when law became visible and immutable. Solon, who came after Draco, transformed Athenian governance not by bloodshed but by compromise. Solon and the Athenian experiment. Athens, by 600 BCE, was racked with inequality. Smallholders were losing land to aristocratic lenders. Debtors were sold into slavery. The social fabric was tearing. In 594 BCE, the Athenians gave extraordinary powers to Solon, an aristocrat poet and reluctant reformer. Solon's reforms were both sweeping and deliberately moderate. Sasachthea, shaking off of burdens. He canceled existing debts and forbade future debt slavery. Property classes. Citizens were categorized by wealth, not birth, determining their eligibility for offices. Council of 400, a new advisory body designed to dilute aristocratic influence. People's Court, a rudimentary form of citizen-led justice. Solon refused to redistribute land or confiscate aristocratic wealth. He also refused to remain in power. After enacting his reforms, he left Athens for 10 years. His reforms failed and the short-term factionalism resumed, and tyranny returned, but he planted the legal and institutional seeds of Athenian democracy. His legacy was not in what he solved, but in what he made possible. Hoplite warfare and the rise of the middle class. While lawgivers shaped governance, another silent revolution was unfolding on the battlefield. In earlier centuries, warfare had been the domain of aristocratic horsemen and elite retainers. But by the 7th century BCE, a new form of warfare emerged: hoplite phalanx. Heavily armed infantry, standing shoulder to shoulder in tight ranks, became the dominant mode of combat. To serve as a hoplite, one had to afford bronze armor, a spear, and a shield not cheap, but within reach for prosperous farmers and artisans. These men, the zeugetai, or yoke-bearing class, began to see themselves as essential to the polis. They bled for it. They died for it. And so, they began to demand a say in its affairs. This military transformation reinforced the idea of collective defense and collective voice. You could not fight as a unit and rule as a class. The phalanx was a metaphor for citizenship, unity through discipline, equality through shared burden. Religious festivals and the civic calendar. Religion in the polis was not separate from politics, it was politics in ritual form. Every major decision was accompanied by sacrifice. Every festival was a declaration of civic unity. By the 6th century, polis had developed structured civic calendars, marking the year through religious and political events. In Athens, festivals like Panathenaea celebrated civic pride and Athena's patronage. Thesmophoria was a female-centered fertility rite reinforcing social roles. Dionysia, with its theater competitions, merged religious ecstasy with civic commentary. These events brought citizens together not just as worshippers but as political beings. Laws were announced, debates were held, public identities were performed. Even temples, often seen as mere religious structures, became de facto treasuries, archives, and symbols of communal strength. The polis as an idea. By the close of the Archaic period, c. 500 BCE, the polis was more than a place, it was a framework of meaning. Territorial, defined by boundaries, fields, sacred groves, and walls. Legal, maintained by inscriptions, magistrates, and courts. Military, protected by hoplites and naval militias. Religious, structured around shared rites, calendars, and myths. Economic, fueled by landholding, trade, coinage, and taxation. Cultural, embodied in stories, statues, and public memory. Yet every polis was fragile. Its unity depended on continued participation, on remembered rituals, on faith in procedures that were often unwritten or contested. A bad harvest, a lost war, or a charismatic demagogue could unravel decades of slow construction. But still, the idea persisted. The prelude to classical governance. By 500 BCE, the Greek world stood on the cusp of a new political reality. In Athens, the groundwork for democracy had been laid. Cleisthenes would soon restructure tribal divisions and introduce the foundations of isonomia, equality under the law. In Sparta, a rigid dual kingship system, paired with the Gerousia, Council of Elders, and the Ephors, had created a strange mixture of oligarchy and militarism. In Delphi, Delos, and Olympia, Panhellenic sanctuaries served as neutral grounds where rival polis negotiated treaties, hosted games, and sought divine arbitration. New leagues and alliances, precursors to later imperial systems, were forming, driven by both fear and opportunity. The polis had survived its turbulent adolescence. What came next was its maturity and, eventually, its transformation. The slow birth of the Greek city-state was not dramatic. It was not forged in a single battle or inscribed in a single law. It was built day by day, ritual by ritual, ledger by ledger. From household hearths to marble colonnades, from forgotten shrines to bustling agoras, from murmured agreements to carved decrees, the polis became one of history's most enduring inventions. And yet a final question lingers. Was the polis merely a product of its time, a solution to specific historical problems? Or was it a prototype of something more universal, the human desire to govern ourselves, however imperfectly, in the company of others? Story 2. Oligarchs and Elders, the rise of aristocratic rule in Corinth. You are standing on the isthmus, the narrow land bridge connecting mainland Greece with the Peloponnese. To one side, the Saronic Gulf, to the other, the Corinthian Gulf. Here lies Corinth, rich, strategic, ambitious. But long before its wealth was measured in coin and column, Corinth was ruled not by kings but by a clan, a family, a name whispered with both reverence and resentment, the Bacchiadi. The story of Corinth's early political life is not one of sweeping reforms or dramatic revolts. It is, instead, a study in control, in reputation, in the quiet machinery of oligarchy governance by the few, cloaked in custom and enforced not by force but by exclusion. Geographical privilege and strategic importance. Before diving into the Bacchiadi themselves, consider Corinth's geography. Its location at the crossroads of Greece made it a linchpin of trade. Two seas, two harbors, Lechium to the west and Cenchreae to the east, gave Corinth unmatched access to maritime commerce. Unlike the more isolated polis nestled in valleys or hillsides, Corinth was a gateway. Goods, ideas, people, they all passed through, and with passage came profit, and with profit power. This economic potential created a city eager for order. Merchants needed predictability, farmers needed protection, artisans needed patrons, and from this need for structure the Bacchiadi rose. Who were the Bacchiadi? According to tradition, the Bacchiadi traced their lineage to Bacchus, a semi-legendary ruler of Corinth. Whether Bacchus was real or mythologized hardly mattered. What mattered was the claim. By the mid-8th century BCE, the Bacchiadi had consolidated power in Corinth. They were not a royal house in the traditional sense, but a clan bound by blood, marriage, and political purpose. Rather than elevate a single king, the Bacchiadi created a closed aristocracy. Only members of the clan could marry each other. Only they could hold the chief magistracy, an annual position called the prytany or polemark, depending on the source. In practice, the Bacchiadi were Corinth. Oligarchy as a system of exclusion. The Bacchiadi's rule illustrates how oligarchies sustain themselves not through brute force, but through careful control of access. Marriage restriction prevented outside families from rising in prominence. Office rotation within the clan gave the appearance of change while preserving core power. Sacred rituals were monopolized by Bacchiadi priests, linking civic and religious legitimacy. Land ownership, especially near the harbors and fertile plains, was consolidated through inheritance and legal maneuvering. To be Bacchiad was to be safe. To not be Bacchiad was to be peripheral. But exclusion creates pressure, and pressure over time finds a crack. Daily life under the Bacchiadi. For the average Corinthian, the Bacchiadi were a distant authority. Most people were farmers, herders, or artisans. They paid tribute, obeyed custom, and participated in public festivals. In exchange, they received a degree of peace and order. Corinth under the Bacchiadi saw economic expansion. Pottery styles, especially the distinctive Corinthian ware, with its ornate animal motifs, became dominant in Mediterranean trade. Black figure technique would later evolve here before spreading to Athens. Workshops flourished. Shipbuilding increased. Colonists were dispatched most notably to Corcyra, modern Corfu, and Syracuse in Sicily, both founded under Bacchiad direction. And yet there were signs of unease. Non-aristocratic families grew wealthier through trade, yet had no voice in governance. Local grievances were settled by Bacchiadi magistrates, often with little recourse. There was stability but not equity. The oligarchic order, while orderly, left no space for outsiders to rise. The role of colonization as pressure valve. One of the Bacchiadi's most successful strategies was colonization. When internal tensions threatened to erupt over land shortages, debt, or generational conflict, the answer was often to send people away. Colonization was framed as opportunity. Volunteers were recruited. Sacred oaths were taken. Cities were founded abroad, mimicking the polis structure of the homeland. This served two purposes. Reduced pressure at home, fewer mouths to feed, fewer malcontents. Expanded Corinthian influence both economically and culturally. Corcyra, in particular, became a powerful outpost. But its eventual rebellion against Corinth would later underscore the fragility of colonial ties, especially when those colonies developed their own ambitions. Still in the 8th and 7th centuries, colonization worked. It exported descent, it enlarged wealth, and it reinforced the Bacchiadi myth of stewardship. Internal fractures and the rise of Cypselus. Every closed system eventually faces a challenge from within. For Corinth, that challenge came in the form of a man named Cypselus. According to tradition, Cypselus was of mixed heritage. His mother, Labda, belonged to the Bacchiadi, but his father did not. His birth alone was controversial. A prophecy claimed that he would one day overthrow the Bacchiadi. Some say assassins were sent. Others say he was hidden in a chest, giving rise to his name, derived from Kypsel, meaning box or chest. As he grew, Cypselus found support among those excluded by the Bacchiadi. Artisans, merchants, land-poor farmers, those who had wealth or skill but no power. By the early 7th century BCE, he mobilized this support and overthrew the Bacchiadi. There was little bloodshed, at least according to sources like Herodotus. Cypselus did not massacre the Bacchiadi, he exiled them. He replaced exclusion with inclusion, but under his own rule. He was the first tyrant of Corinth. But what does it mean that a tyrant was welcomed? The Quiet Revolution. Cypselus' rise marks a critical moment in the story of Greek governance. Here was a man, outside the elite structure, who gained power not by inheritance, but by exploiting the rigidity of aristocracy. He did not promise chaos. He promised openness governance for those previously ignored. His rule, which began around 657 BCE, did not dismantle the polis. He preserved its rituals, courts, and festivals. He even launched public works projects, invested in temples, and maintained Corinth's colonies. In essence, he kept the machine running but changed the hands at the controls. To call this a revolution feels too loud, but it was a quiet upheaval, a signal that oligarchy, while stable, could not contain a city forever. As the Bacchiadi vanished from public life, some into exile, others into history, the people of Corinth faced a new reality. The clan was gone, but was Cypselus a liberator or just another kind of ruler? How would his governance differ from theirs, when power still flowed through one man? When Cypselus exiled the Bacchiadi from Corinth, he did not crown himself king. He took no title that suggested divine right or eternal rule. Instead, he presented himself as a leader of the people, tyrannos, a word that meant ruler without legal sanction, but not yet with its later connotation of cruelty. What followed was not an age of terror, but of calculated transformation. Cypselus' tyranny was built not on fear, but on foundation, stone by stone, project by project, institution by institution. His was a tyranny of administration, of infrastructure, and of imagery. If the Bacchiadi ruled from behind closed doors, Cypselus ruled in full view of the agora. Tyranny without terror. Herodotus, writing over a century later, claims that Cypselus ruled for 30 years without need of a bodyguard. This may be idealized, but it suggests something important. His rule was accepted, or at least tolerated, by the people of Corinth. Why? The Bacchiadi had alienated everyone but themselves. Cypselus offered opportunity. His tyranny was not revenge, it was reorientation. He preserved institutions that functioned, purged those that excluded, and redistributed access to power, though never fully. He governed through pragmatism, not ideology. His power was personal but embedded in public works, civic ritual, and patronage. And above all, he built infrastructure as political theater. Cypselus understood that to rule a city, you must shape it physically. And so, Corinth under his tyranny became a city of construction. Temples, he invested in religious architecture, linking his rule to divine favor. The earliest phases of the Temple of Apollo likely date to this era, its columns heavy and Doric, its presence looming over the city. Harbors, trade was Corinth's lifeblood, and Cypselus expanded and improved both Lechium and Cenchrese, deepening ties with colonies and foreign merchants. Roadways, land routes were maintained and expanded, facilitating movement between city and port. Public buildings. While few foundations survive, literary sources suggest an increase in communal infrastructure, stoas, treasuries, and possibly assembly spaces. Each project served a double purpose. It employed citizens, circulated wealth, and bound civic identity to the tyrant's vision. But it also advertised his capability. Where the Bacchiadi ruled invisibly, Cypselus left stone behind. Religious patronage and legitimation. Cypselus was not a priest, but he understood the power of sacred narrative. He made generous dedications at Delphi, the spiritual center of the Greek world. Most famously, he commissioned a richly decorated chest, which was displayed at the Delphic sanctuary and described in detail by Pausanias centuries later. This chest was not merely an offering, it was a myth-making device. It showed scenes of gods, heroes, and human struggle. According to legend, it was also the very chest in which Cypselus had been hidden as an infant, escaping Bacchiadi assassins. Whether this was true or not didn't matter. It was remembered. Delphi's blessing gave his rule cosmic weight. His personal story became a political allegory. The child of prophecy, the survivor, the righteous usurper. By wrapping his tyranny in sacred symbolism, Cypselus made himself unchallengeable without impiety. Managing the aristocracy. Not all aristocrats were exiled. Some accepted Cypselus' rule and were rewarded. Others disappeared from the record. The mechanisms of his governance remain partially obscured, but we can infer several strategies. Divide and rule. By avoiding any single advisory council, Cypselus likely pitted elite families against one another, ensuring no coordinated opposition. Marital alliances. He married into notable lineages and arranged matches for his supporters. Local magistracies. Instead of eliminating offices, he repopulated them with loyalists or those from the mercantile class. Exile as a tool. Unlike later tyrants who used execution, Cypselus favored banishment, a cleaner method that removed threats without martyring them. His genius lay in rebalancing power without fully destabilizing the system. Aristocrats remained, but on his terms. Economic policy and trade expansion. Corinth's economy blossomed during Cypselus' rule. Pottery production expanded further, especially in the black figure and orientalizing styles. Corinthian vases were found from Etruria to Syria, each bearing the mark of artisans whose work now carried global demand. Coinage had not yet emerged widely, but wealth was measured in kind, in land, and in trade goods. Cypselus promoted new commercial ventures. Encouragement of foreign merchants, including Phoenician and Egyptian traders. Preferential harbor arrangements for allies and colonies. Protection of trade routes, both maritime and inland. His policies turned Corinth into an economic powerhouse. By the end of his rule, the city was among the richest in the Greek world. And yet, prosperity brought its own tensions. The role of colonies in sustaining tyranny. Just as the Bacchiadi had used colonization as a pressure valve, Cypselus employed it as a policy of power projection. Ambracia, Anactorian, and Lucas, all colonies founded or strengthened under his rule, extended Corinth's reach into western Greece and beyond. Syracuse, while technically a Bacchiad colony, retained Corinthian allegiance, serving as a vital grain hub. But colonies also became ideological symbols, proof that Cypselus was not only stabilizing Corinth, but exporting its strength. These settlements bore the imprint of his tyranny-structured governance, planned harbors, and strong ties to the metropolis. Yet every colony also risked developing independence, as Corcyra would demonstrate decades later. Empire building is always a gamble. The image of the tyrant. While Cypselus did not use force to maintain rule, he was not without control. His image was carefully managed. He was both shepherd and sentinel. We have no surviving statues of him, no public inscriptions in his name. But the myths, the Delphi chest, and the lack of recorded uprisings suggest a man who cultivated support rather than demanded submission. This is the paradox of early tyranny. It relied on charisma more than coercion. And charisma, unlike law, is fleeting. Cypselus' reign ended in peace. He died in office and passed power to his son, Periander. For a moment, it appeared that tyranny might become dynastic. But would Periander inherit his father's restraint? You inherit a city, but not just its walls and temples. You inherit its ambitions, its unrest, its memory of what came before. When Periander, son of Cypselus, assumed control of Corinth around 627 BCE, he stepped into the shadow of a man who had dismantled an oligarchy, and replaced it with pragmatic, popular rule. But Periander was not his father. Though he continued many of Cypselus' policies, his reign marked a shift, a tightening of control, a heavier hand, and the transformation of tyranny from practical compromise into ideological dominance. To understand Periander is to understand how absolute power, even with brilliant governance, begins to corrode. The man and the myths. Periander's reputation is a puzzle of contradictions. Ancient sources, especially Herodotus and later writers, portray him as wise and cruel, austere and decadent, a philosopher king and a paranoid despot. He was later included among the 7 sages of Greece, a group of semi-mythical lawgivers and thinkers. Yet he was also accused of horrific acts: the murder of his wife Melissa, sexual violence, the mutilation of women, and the exile of his own son. It's difficult to separate fact from slander. Much of this was written long after his death, when tyranny had become politically suspect across the Greek world. But one thing is certain: Periander ruled Corinth for over 4 decades, and Corinth thrived. The real question is how. Bureaucratic tyranny and centralization. Unlike his father, who relied on charisma and patronage, Periander leaned on institutional control. Taxes were codified and expanded. Import and export duties enriched the city and the state. Harbor fees were streamlined, bringing consistency to trade logistics. State monopolies may have existed on certain crafts or materials, allowing for control of key economic sectors. Infrastructure continued to grow notably. The dialkos, a paved trackway that allowed ships to be moved across the isthmus, bypassing dangerous sea routes and giving Corinth unmatched commercial advantage. All of this required record-keeping, officers, and bureaucrats. Periander's government was not large by modern standards, but it was systematic. His tyranny was organized, not chaotic. This is what made it powerful and dangerous. Internal security and surveillance. Periander did not tolerate dissent. After early attempts to allow criticism, perhaps inherited from Cypselus' broader base of support, he quickly turned authoritarian. Exiles became frequent. Disloyal citizens were sent away, often to colonies or rival polis. Informal surveillance networks were likely used to monitor speech and gatherings. Public decrees may have emphasized unity, piety, and obedience, using religious justification for political control. Herodotus tells a symbolic tale. When Periander sought advice on ruling harsh citizens, he consulted Thrasybulus, the tyrant of Miletus. Thrasybulus said nothing. He simply walked through a field, cutting off the tallest ears of grain. Periander understood: eliminate the ambitious. Whether true or not, the story captures the ethos of his rule. He governed not with the people but over them. Cultural patronage, and the tyrant as builder. Despite his authoritarianism, Periander was a great patron of the arts. Poets like Arrian of Methymna, credited with inventing the dithyramb, a form of choral song, found support in Corinth. Public festivals grew in size and sophistication, helping to create a shared civic identity rooted in spectacle and ritual. Temples and public buildings continued to rise. Corinth became an architectural showpiece. Periander understood that public grandeur bought tolerance. A well-fed, well-employed, and regularly entertained population was less likely to rebel even under an iron hand. The tyrant's paradox is this: he must dazzle as much as he dominates. Foreign policy and diplomacy. Corinth under Periander was not inward-looking. He maintained close ties with Lydia under King Aliates, and Egypt under the Sate dynasty, promoting trade and political cooperation. He extended Corinth's colonial network, reinforcing ties with Ambracia, Lucas, and Anactorian. These colonies acted as strategic outposts, trade partners, and buffers against foreign threats. But perhaps most impressively, he balanced Corinth's interests without provoking war, a rarity in Greek history. His diplomacy was subtle, grounded in trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Where others sought conquest, Periander sought control through influence. Decline and succession crisis. For all his achievements, Periander could not escape the traps of hereditary rule. His chosen successor was his son Lycophron, but their relationship was poisoned by personal tragedy. After Melissa's death, variously attributed to accident, anger, or murder, Lycophron broke from his father. He refused communication, fled the court, and was eventually sent into exile. In desperation, Periander attempted to bring him back from Corcyra, where he had been living. When the Corcyraeans refused to release him, Periander reportedly retaliated by abducting young boys from the island and forcing them into servitude. Again, history blends into legend, but the consequences were real. Corinth's control over Corcyra weakened, and Periander died without a secure successor. The tyranny ended not with revolt, but with a power vacuum. Corinth fell into aristocratic rule once more, but a less rigid one, tempered by 2 generations of tyrannical centralization. The legacy of the Cypselid tyranny. So what did Cypselus and Periander leave behind? A strong, prosperous city-state. Corinth became one of the wealthiest and most influential polis of the Archaic period. Its ports, artisans, and colonies shaped Mediterranean commerce for generations. A model of tyranny. The Cypselids showed that tyranny could be efficient, civic-minded, and long-lasting so long as it responded to public needs. But they also demonstrated the dangers of personalization, paranoia, and succession disputes. Cultural confidence. Corinthian art, architecture, and music flourished under their rule. Corinth's temples, vases, and festivals became the envy of the Greek world. Institutional memory. Even after the tyranny ended, Corinth's experience with centralized administration left its mark. Later oligarchic systems were more nuanced, more inclusive, and more aware of the power of public perception. The end of tyranny and the return of the few. When the Cypselid line collapsed, Corinth did not become a democracy. Power returned to the elite but not the Bacchiati. A new oligarchy emerged, one that had learned from both the failures of exclusion and the effectiveness of centralized rule. The result was a hybrid model, aristocratic in form, but cautious, professional, and attentive to the mood of the citizenry. Tyranny had broken the old order, but it had also provided the tools for a more resilient one. And perhaps that is the paradox of history's most successful tyrants. They rarely survive in memory, but their institutions do. Story 3. The Lycurgan Mirage, Spartan Governance and the Myth of Equality. You walk into a land unlike any other in ancient Greece, Laconia, home to Sparta. Here, the mountains rise sharply and the valleys are narrow. Olive trees line the Eurotas River, and every field seems watched, measured, accounted for. But the people do not chatter in the agora. There is no bustling trade market. There are no walls around the city. The Spartans have no need of them, they say. Their walls are their men. And their men are trained from birth to be warriors, not for personal glory, not for conquest, but for preservation of order, discipline, sameness. You are entering a world shaped by the elusive figure of Lycurgus, a man or myth whose reforms created one of the most famous and misunderstood political systems in ancient history. Before Lycurgus, the prehistoric Laconian landscape. To understand Sparta, we must begin before it was Sparta. The region of Laconia had been inhabited for centuries before the rise of the polis. Mycenaean ruins suggest a palatial center at Amyclae, and archaeological traces show continuity of settlement even through the Greek Dark Age. Yet unlike Athens or Corinth, there was no immediate urban concentration. The Spartans did not emerge from a singular city, but from the merging of villages, synocism, likely completed by the 9th or 8th century BCE. This unification created the basis for a collective identity, even before a collective government. The resulting settlement, Sparta, was not a city in the conventional sense: no central acropolis, no grand agora, no harbor. It was a network of hamlets, held together by kinship, religion, and later, iron discipline. Conquest of Messenia, the roots of militarism. In the late 8th century BCE, the Spartans launched a rare and ambitious campaign, the conquest of Messenia, their fertile neighbor to the west. Unlike typical Greek colonization, which sent people abroad, the Spartans turned inward, conquering adjacent land and enslaving its inhabitants. These conquered peoples, the Helots, became state-owned serfs, bound to the land and forced to give half their produce to their Spartan overlords. But Helots vastly outnumbered their masters, and that imbalance would define Sparta forever. Where other Greek polis feared outside invasion, Sparta feared internal revolt. The response was unique: build a society trained for vigilance, where every male citizen was a soldier, every action rehearsed, and every deviation punished. This transformation from farmer warriors to full-time hoplites required radical change. And here enters Lycurgus. The Lycurgan enigma. Who was Lycurgus? Ancient sources contradict themselves. Some claim he was a 9th century lawgiver. Others place him in the 7th century. Still others argue he never existed at all. Plutarch, writing centuries later, gives a semi-mythical biography filled with travel, prophecy, and divine inspiration. But regardless of his historicity, Lycurgus was credited with the Great Retra, the foundational constitution of Sparta. According to legend, Lycurgus journeyed to Delphi, received a prophecy from Apollo, and returned with laws that would shape Sparta forever. These laws were not written down. They were oral, sacred, and unchangeable. They governed everything from the composition of the government to child-rearing practices and meal routines. They were not laws for prosperity. They were laws for permanence. The Spartan political structure, a mixed constitution. The Lycurgan system created a unique blend of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy. Each branch counterbalanced the others. The dual kingship. Sparta had two hereditary kings from two royal houses, the Agids and the Eurypontids. They led the army and performed religious duties, but were not absolute rulers. The Gerousia, Council of Elders, consisting of 28 elders all over age 60, plus the two kings. This council proposed laws and served as a high court. The Apella Assembly. All male citizens over 30 could participate. They voted on proposals by shouting approval, but their power was minimal. The Ephors, overseers, 5 magistrates elected annually. They checked the power of the kings and could even bring them to trial. This mixed constitution was admired by later thinkers like Plato and Polybius for its apparent balance. But in practice, it was deeply conservative, designed not to adapt but to preserve. Radical equality, or the illusion of it. Spartan society is often romanticized as an egalitarian utopia of warrior citizens. Indeed, male citizen Spartiates were treated as equals. They received state-allotted land, dined in communal mess halls, and trained in the agoge, the rigorous state education system. Private wealth was discouraged. Coinage was iron, luxury frowned upon. The ideal was austere sameness. But equality had boundaries. Perioik, free non-citizens lived in surrounding villages, performed trade and paid taxes, but held no political rights. Helots, the majority population, were enslaved, humiliated, and controlled through state-sanctioned terror. Women, while better educated and freer than in other polis, had no political role. Only native-born males who completed the agoge and contributed to the common mess were full citizens. Thus, Spartan equality was a myth of uniformity, not inclusion. It depended on exclusion and coercion. Social engineering, the agoge and cryptia. Spartan stability relied not just on law but on socialization. From the age of 7, boys entered the agoge. They were removed from their families, trained in endurance, obedience, and combat, encouraged to steal food to sharpen survival skills, but punished if caught, taught to speak briefly, sharply giving rise to the term laconic. At age 20, they joined a session, or mess group essential for citizenship. They would serve in the army until 60. For the helots, a darker institution loomed, the crypteia, a secret police of selected young Spartans. It acted during helot unrest using surveillance, intimidation, and sometimes ritualized murder to keep the population in fear. These systems were not afterthoughts. They were the pillars of Spartan governance, not about justice, but control. The absence of written law. Unlike Athens, where law was debated, revised, and recorded, Spartan law remained oral and sacred. The Great Retra, though occasionally paraphrased, was never inscribed in its entirety. This preserved flexibility for elites and rigidity for everyone else. Disputes were resolved by custom and the decisions of the gerousia or ephors. The absence of written law discouraged public challenge. Authority rested on tradition and fear of change. What Lycurgus, or the idea of him, created was not a republic, but a memory machine, a system in which deviation was not disagreement, but sacrilege. Sparta in isolation. Sparta's internal order came at a cost. The polis was famously xenophobic. Foreigners were discouraged. Trade was limited. The arts, while not absent, were subordinated to discipline. Whereas Corinth or Athens thrived on interaction, Sparta turned inward. This inwardness fostered cohesion, but also stagnation. Sparta innovated little in science, philosophy, or architecture. Its stability was impressive, but fragile, dependent on a narrow ruling class and a vast, resentful underclass. And yet, many Greeks admired Sparta for its order, for its simplicity, for its ability to endure. But endurance is not the same as resilience. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the Lycurgan system appeared invincible. Spartan boys were still entering the agoge. The helots still tilled the fields. The dual kings still presided over sacrifices. But outside the valley, the world was changing. Tyrannies rose, democracies flickered into being. Coinage began circulating, the arts exploded. And Sparta remained still. Was that strength or the beginning of decline? By the early 6th century BCE, Sparta stood out as a polis apart, not in terms of splendor or innovation, but in stability. Where other cities experimented with tyranny, trade, and civic reform, Sparta seemed to have settled into a rigid and unyielding rhythm: agoge, assembly, obedience. But Spartan governance was not static. Though its institutions were designed for conservation rather than change, they still had to operate, and to do so, they had to deal with internal unrest, foreign diplomacy, and growing geopolitical ambition. This was a society designed to maintain itself. And maintenance, in a world of shifting alliances and simmering rebellion, was never passive. It required vigilance, intervention, and occasionally, brute force disguised as constitutional order. The ephorate, the silent power. Of all the governing institutions in Sparta, none was more enigmatic or more powerful than the ephors. These 5 officials, elected annually from among the citizen body, had no direct precedent in other Greek city-states. They were not priests, they were not kings, yet they possessed a unique mix of executive, judicial, and supervisory powers. Check the kings, authority they could summon, and even indict a king if his actions threatened the laws or stability of the polis. Oversaw education. The ephors monitored the agoge, ensuring boys were properly trained in discipline and obedience. Managed foreign policy, often led embassies and negotiated treaties. Controlled helots authorized and orchestrated the crypteia, the secret police force used to terrorize helots. The ephorate acted as the institutional conscience of Sparta, not idealistic, but deeply pragmatic. Their role was to keep the system from drifting into either monarchy or mob rule. They were also dangerous. 5 men, elected yearly, with unchecked authority. But in a system built on the fear of internal collapse, danger was part of the design. The Gerousia, conservatism in council. If the ephors were the guardians of the present, the Gerousia represented the weight of the past. Comprised of 28 elders over 60, plus the 2 kings, this council of old men wielded legislative and judicial power. Only the Gerousia could propose laws to the assembly. Only it could serve as a supreme court, judging capital cases including those against kings. Election to the Gerousia was for life, and selection was made through an opaque process involving public acclamation more performative than democratic. The Gerousia was a mechanism of institutional memory. Its members were not innovators. They were preservers. They upheld the great retra, interpreted unwritten norms, and pushed back against anything that smelled of novelty. In this way, the Gerousia reinforced Sparta's self-image, a city governed by the wisdom of the aged, not the whims of the youthful. The apella, passive citizenship. Sparta's apella, its citizen assembly, was an odd creature among Greek democratic experiments. Technically, all male citizens over 30 could participate, but their role was limited. They could vote on proposals submitted by the Gerousia. They could approve kings' decisions, such as declarations of war. They could elect ephors and members of the Gerousia. But they could not debate. The vote was taken by shouting, with the loudest acclamation determining the result. No speeches, no counter-proposals, no policy initiatives from below. The apella served as a mechanism of consent, not deliberation. To the outside world this may have seemed odd, but to Spartans it was balance, rule by the few with the appearance of the many. Spartan diplomacy, expansion without empire. Though often seen as isolationist, Sparta was deeply involved in interstate affairs, especially through the formation of the Peloponnesian League. This alliance, solidified by the late 6th century BCE, was not a formal empire. Member states retained autonomy but were required to provide troops for joint military campaigns, align with Sparta's foreign policy, not wage war against fellow members without league approval. Sparta, in return, promised protection not just from external enemies, but from internal revolution. In an age of frequent tyranny and democratic experimentation, many Peloponnesian cities preferred Spartan order to freedom. The League was Sparta's answer to Athenian maritime power, a land-based coalition, conservative, stable, and militarily formidable. It was, in many ways, an extension of internal governance. Just as helots were subdued by systemic force, so too were allies held in place by Spartan prestige and calculated intervention. The management of the helots. Helots were not slaves in the Athenian sense. They were not bought and sold as property, but they were bound to the land and brutally subjugated. They farmed the land of the Spartiates and gave a significant portion of their produce to their masters. They could marry, have families, and retain some autonomy, but they could be beaten at will, humiliated in public festivals, and murdered without legal consequence. To manage this internal threat, Sparta employed ritualized fear. The crypteia. Young Spartan men were sent into the countryside under cover of night to spy on, assassinate, or terrorize helots. Annual declarations of war. The ephors declared war on the helots each year, legally permitting their killing without religious pollution. Festivals of humiliation. During events like the Gymnopedia, helots were forced to get drunk and perform for Spartiate audiences mockery as control. The irony is sharp. A society that claimed to be built on equality relied entirely on a system of hereditary servitude. But for the Spartans, the Helots were not people. They were a problem, a constant threat that justified militarism and solidarity. Women in the Spartan system. In contrast to other Greek polis, Spartan women had a degree of freedom and status that baffled outsiders. They were educated, often alongside boys until the age of 7. They owned property and managed estates, especially when men were at war. They were encouraged to be strong, athletic, and outspoken, so they could bear vigorous sons. But this relative independence was not a gesture toward equality. It was functional. Strong women produced strong offspring. Land inheritance was necessary to preserve wealth within the citizen class, and the management of estates freed men for full-time military service. Spartan women were partners in preservation, not agents of change. Sparta's success and the seeds of stagnation. By the early 5th century BCE, Sparta had achieved a kind of political miracle. No major internal revolts. No rise of tyrants. No radical reforms or experiments. The Lycurgan system had endured for over 2 centuries, creating one of the most stable regimes in the ancient world. But stability came with costs. Cultural stagnation. Sparta produced few poets, artists, or thinkers. Economic rigidity. Spartan disdain for trade and coinage limited flexibility. Demographic crisis. The citizen population declined, unable to replenish its numbers due to strict citizenship laws and high mortality in war. Over-reliance on fear. The system required constant vigilance and violence to maintain control over the Helot majority. And outside Sparta, the world was changing. The coming challenge. In 508 BCE, Athens embarked on a radical democratic experiment, restructured by Cleisthenes. In Ionia, the Greek cities chafed under Persian domination, and calls for rebellion grew louder. Sparta, meanwhile, looked inward, still governed by laws that no one dared write down. Could a society so carefully constructed for preservation respond to a world that demanded innovation? Could the very strengths of Spartan governance, its discipline, conservatism, and obsession with sameness, become the reason for its eventual decline? The Spartan system had endured. Its citizens were few but fiercely trained, its institutions rigid but functional, its mythos founded in discipline, duty, and unity projected strength. But the world was not still. By the dawn of the 5th century BCE, the Greek world faced new forces. Persia, with its vast empire and efficient satrapy system, Athens, increasingly bold and democratic, and the growing reality that military might would no longer be confined to hoplites marching in tight phalanx formations. Sparta stood at a crossroads. To remain unchanged was to risk irrelevance. To adapt was to risk unraveling the very social fabric it had spent centuries perfecting. This final phase of early Spartan governance is a study in external glory masking internal decay. Sparta in the Persian Wars, reluctant leadership. In 490 BCE, as Persian forces approached the Greek mainland, Sparta was called upon to lead the Hellenic defense. Sparta had long been seen as the most powerful land force in Greece, but it was not eager to act quickly. When the Athenians requested aid before the Battle of Marathon, the Spartans delayed, citing a religious festival, the Carnia, which forbade warfare until the full moon. Whether this was genuine piety or political caution is unknown. The result: Athens stood alone and won. Yet by 480 BCE, during the Second Persian invasion, Sparta rose to the occasion. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans became legendary at Thermopylae, holding the narrow pass against overwhelming Persian forces. Though they were defeated, the act was seen as heroic self-sacrifice. Sparta's naval contributions were limited, but its prestige surged. It became the undisputed leader of the Peloponnesian League, its reputation grounded not in wealth or culture, but in valor and order. Athens ascends, Sparta hesitates. After the Persian defeat, Athens began to rise with astonishing speed. The Delian League, initially an anti-Persian alliance, turned into an Athenian empire. The Athenians rebuilt their city with marble, adorned it with temples, and made democracy not only functional but proud. They built a powerful navy, funded by tribute, and extended influence across the Aegean. Sparta watched and worried. Sparta's government, so focused on stability, was ill-suited for rapid response. Its assembly could not debate policy. Its gerousia, made of old men, was cautious. The ephors, powerful but temporary, rarely enacted long-term strategy. Even Sparta's famed army was inflexible. While invincible on land in pitched battle, it lacked versatility. Naval warfare, siegecraft, and economic competition lay outside its design. To Athens' dynamism, Sparta offered stillness. The Great Earthquake and the Helot Revolt, c. 464 BCE. In 464 BCE, a massive earthquake struck Laconia, leveling buildings and killing thousands. The Helots seized the moment. A large-scale Helot revolt erupted especially in Messenia, where the memory of conquest and subjugation still burned. The rebellion lasted for years and was only crushed with great difficulty. Sparta, unexpectedly vulnerable, appealed to its allies for help. Athens sent hoplites under Cimon, but upon arrival, the Spartans sent them home, fearing that democratic soldiers might sympathize with the rebels. This incident fractured the Athens-Sparta relationship. It also exposed a terrifying truth. Sparta's stability was fragile, dependent not on law or wealth, but on constant repression and the physical presence of its citizen soldiers. The Peloponnesian War, preservation versus progress. By 431 BCE, tensions between Athens and Sparta erupted into full-scale conflict, the Peloponnesian War. The war was not just military, it was ideological. Athens represented innovation, commerce, democracy, and naval supremacy. Sparta stood for tradition, land power, hierarchy, and restraint. The war dragged on for nearly 30 years, devastating Greece. Sparta, initially dominant on land, struggled to strike at Athens' empire. Only after receiving Persian funding did Sparta build a fleet capable of victory. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. Sparta had won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of maintaining the war effort, accepting foreign aid, and garrisoning allies strained the Spartan system. It was now an empire with no imperial mechanism, forced to play the very role it had once scorned. And at home, the citizen population continued to shrink. The shrinking of the Spartiates. Spartan society was based on a precarious formula. A small core of Spartiates, full citizen, supported by a larger population of Perioc, free non-citizens, and a vast underclass of Helots. But over time, several forces eroded the citizen body. War losses, hoplite warfare was lethal. Many Spartiates died without male heirs. Inheritance concentration. Wealth and land accumulated in fewer hands, leading to oligarchic stratification even within the citizen class. Strict citizenship laws. Sparta refused to grant citizenship to outsiders or children of mixed parentage. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the number of full citizens had dropped dramatically from around 9,000 at its peak to fewer than 1,000. To preserve the illusion of equality, Sparta had to become more unequal, assigning greater burdens to fewer men, and relying more heavily on helots and mercenaries. The mirage becomes a mirror. In many ways, Sparta's success in war exposed the limits of its governance. Victory required naval power, foreign diplomacy, and taxation, all things Sparta distrusted. Post-war administration demanded bureaucracy and empire-building institutions Sparta never developed. Cultural leadership required art, philosophy, and rhetoric, realms Sparta had deliberately starved. Athens lost the war, but left behind a legacy of democracy, architecture, literature, and inquiry. Sparta, by contrast, left behind a system so rigid it could not reproduce itself. Even Spartans began to sense the dissonance. Philosophers like Plato admired Sparta's simplicity but lamented its barrenness. Later thinkers saw the Lycurgan system not as a model, but as a warning. The end of the classical polis. By the 4th century BCE, Sparta's authority would decline rapidly. Theban generals, including Epaminondas, would defeat Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE. Messenia would regain independence. Macedon under Philip II would rise as a new hegemon, rendering all city-states obsolete. Sparta remained a city, but no longer a model. Its institutions persisted in name but not in spirit. Its citizens declined. Its helots vanished into memory. Its laws were preserved, but only as historical curiosities. The Lycurgan system had succeeded in creating a society that could survive unchanged for centuries. But in doing so, it created a society that could not change when it needed to survive. Reflection, the dream and the danger of order. Sparta's governance, built on discipline and fear, was not irrational. It solved real problems: internal unrest, social inequality, and the threat of revolution. Its institutions were elegant in their conservatism. Its citizens were trained in self-restraint. Its leaders were accountable within a closed loop. But it achieved this by suppressing creativity, rejecting flexibility, and sanctifying sameness. Lycurgus, whether man or myth, did not create utopia. He created a machine, and that machine, for all its precision, could not adapt to a world that refused to stand still. Sparta endures in memory, but what exactly are we remembering? The strength of discipline, the cost of fear, the illusion of equality? Or something deeper, that even in history, the systems we admire most may be the ones most destined to break? Story 4. Athenian Archons. Bureaucracy before democracy. Before democracy, there was bureaucracy. Athens, so often celebrated for its democratic legacy, was not always a land of open assemblies and popular rule. Long before Cleisthenes, long before Pericles, and even before Solon, the city was governed by a small group of officials known as archons. These archons were not kings, nor were they tyrants. They were functionaries, bound by time, duty, and tradition. And while their names rarely appear in grand historical epics, their roles tell a different kind of story, a story of institutional evolution, of how Athens transitioned from monarchy to oligarchy, and eventually to something more inclusive. This is the story of how paperwork, process, and precedent laid the foundation for political revolution. From kingship to magistracy. The earliest form of governance in Athens was monarchy, a basileus or king, who wielded military, religious, and judicial authority. But by around 700 BCE, this kingship had become hereditary only in theory. The power of the king was being eroded by aristocratic clans, who increasingly saw kingship as an outdated vestige. What replaced it was the archonship, a magistracy that at first mirrored the king's role, but gradually broke it into parts. Archon Eponymous, the most prominent office, responsible for civic administration. Each year was named after the individual who held this role. Archon Basileus retained religious functions of the former kings, presiding over ancestral cults, sacred trials, and festivals. Polemarch took on military command, leading troops and organizing war efforts. Later, 6 additional Thesmothetai, law-setters, were added, bringing the total number of archons to 9. But make no mistake, these were not popular appointments. They were aristocratic positions, filled by members of elite families, selected through opaque processes. And yet, their emergence represented a profound shift. Athens was beginning to run on offices, not personalities. The role of the Eupatridae, governance by lineage. The archons came from the Eupatridae, those of good fathers. This elite class dominated Athenian political life for centuries, tracing their ancestry to heroic forebears and leveraging their lineage for influence. These aristocrats controlled land, temples, and courts. More importantly, they controlled access to office. The archonship was initially a life term, but by the 7th century BCE, it was reduced to 10 years and eventually to 1 year per office. While this appeared to democratize governance, it was still a tightly controlled loop power circulating among a small pool of families. What the Eupatridae feared most was not foreign invasion, it was internal dissent. And so they built a bureaucracy that looked stable, predictable, and timeless. But beneath that surface, pressure built. The archons in practice, administrative functions. Despite their elite background, archons were not monarchs in disguise. They were limited by time. 1-year terms prevented long-term accumulation of power. Scope: each archon had a defined set of duties. Accountability: archons could be held to account after leaving office. Let's explore their functions more closely. Archon eponymous oversaw public festivals, family law, inheritance disputes, and guardianship of orphans. His name defined the year, anchoring time to a person. Archon Basilius supervised religious purity, investigated sacrilege, and held jurisdiction over sacred rites and homicide cases. Polemarch, initially a military leader, the role became more ceremonial over time, handling medics, resident foreigners, their rights and disputes. The Smothetai administered justice more broadly, helped maintain legal traditions, and possibly managed early law records. While these roles may seem dry, they formed the spine of the polis, ensuring continuity, adjudicating disputes, and upholding sacred customs. This is how Athens was governed, through formality, ritual, and rotating office holders. Written law begins to emerge. As disputes grew more complex and memory less reliable, Athens began to flirt with the idea of codified law. One of the most infamous early attempts came through Draco in the late 7th century BCE. Commissioned to write down the laws, perhaps as a response to aristocratic inconsistency, Draco produced a legal code that was notable for its brutality. Minor crimes were punished by death. Property violations carried capital penalties. Homicide was divided into categories: intentional and unintentional, a major legal innovation. Though most of Draco's laws were later repealed, his reforms introduced the concept of publicly known rules. The law was no longer the private memory of aristocrats, it was an object, a text, available in theory to all. For the archons, this changed everything. Now their judgments could be measured against a standard, not always fairly, but more transparently. Aristocracy under stress. By the early 6th century BCE, Athens was at a breaking point. Wealth inequality had deepened. Small farmers lost land to aristocrats. Debt bondage became widespread. Many Athenians sold themselves or their children into slavery to repay loans. Legal protection favored the powerful, and offices remained closed to commoners. Social mobility was effectively blocked. The archonship, once a symbol of order, had become a barrier to reform. Demands grew louder for change, not revolution but redesign. And the man chosen to lead this transformation was Solon. Solon's archonship and the precedent for reform, 594 BCE. Solon was appointed archon eponymous with extraordinary powers in 594 BCE. A poet, aristocrat, and mediator, He understood that compromise, not conquest, was the only path forward. He enacted reforms in several areas. 1. Debt cancellation, Thea. Abolished all existing debts. Prohibited future debt slavery. Freed Athenians who had been enslaved abroad. 2. Property-based classes. Reorganized citizens into 4 economic classes based on annual produce. Higher classes could hold higher offices, but thetes, the lowest, could still attend the assembly. 3. Legal access. Allowed any citizen to bring a lawsuit on behalf of another. Encouraged broader civic participation in legal affairs. 4. Council of 400 Boule. Created a new advisory body to check aristocratic dominance. Solon did not create democracy, but he weakened the monopoly of the Eupatridae and began the long process of opening political participation. Importantly, he left office voluntarily and went into self-imposed exile, refusing to explain or revise his laws. The archonship after Solon. Following Solon's reforms, the archonship remained central, but it was no longer untouchable. Eligibility widened, though wealth still mattered. The rise of popular institutions like the People's Court and the expanded assembly began to overshadow the archon's authority. By the late 6th century, the archonship became a stepping stone, not the pinnacle of power. Eventually, under Cleisthenes, democratic reforms in 508 BCE, archons were selected by lot, a radical move that severed the tie between office and class. The archonship survived, but as part of a broader system, no longer as its engine. Conclusion: bureaucracy as prelude. The Athenian archons are rarely celebrated. They were not warriors or philosophers. They did not fight epic battles or build marble temples. But they administrated. They created predictability, separated functions, codified roles. They made it possible for governance to be transferred, for reform to occur, and eventually for citizens to participate. They turned rule into process, a profound, if boring, achievement. And that process would become the canvas upon which Athenian democracy was eventually painted. As the dust settled after Solon's reforms, Athens found itself in a strange new balance, not quite an aristocracy, not yet a democracy. The Eupatridae had lost their absolute grip on power. The poorest citizens were no longer enslaved by debt, but the structure of Athenian government remained highly fragile. The archonship, still the most visible office in the city, had evolved into an instrument of mediation, part symbol of stability, part battlefield for power struggles. Now, it had to accommodate a rising middle class, emerging civic institutions, and the increasingly volatile passions of the demos. This was an age of transitional governance, an in-between period where process held society together, while political identity caught up. And at the center of it all were the archons, no longer uncontested elites, but figures negotiating a changing civic order. Solon legacy: reform without revolution. Solon's reforms had been designed to preserve the polis, not to overturn it. He believed in a measured middle path, eunomia, or good order, that would ease the tensions between the rich and poor. And for a time, his vision worked. The archonship became open to the top 3 economic classes. The assembly, ecclesia, was now more than a formality. It heard appeals, ratified decisions, and began to sense its own weight. Legal recourse expanded. Citizens could initiate cases on behalf of others, laying the groundwork for future popular courts. The Council of 400, a proto-bull, created space for advisory governance outside the aristocracy. But Solon had made a crucial miscalculation. He did not redistribute land, nor did he dismantle the structures that gave aristocrats informal dominance over law and religion. Most archons were still selected from the Eupatrid class, and custom, rather than constitution, preserved their influence. So while the system looked broader, it remained deeply conservative beneath the surface. Factionalism and the return of political instability. The decades following Solon were marked by conflict among elite families, many of whom competed for control of the archonship and the city's trajectory. Three major factions emerged: the men of the plain, representing the large landowners; the men of the coast, favoring trade and economic growth; the men of the hill, largely composed of poorer citizens, artisans, and farmers. These factions fought not in open war but through ritualized political competition, archon elections, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The archonship, once a symbol of continuity, became a prize, seized by those with resources and popular appeal. Out of this tension emerged a man whose name would become synonymous with benevolent tyranny: Pisistratus. Pisistratus and the tyranny within the Constitution. Pisistratus, an aristocrat with populist instincts, exploited the factionalism of the 560s BCE to seize power as a tyrant, but not in the traditional sense. He did not abolish the archonship. He allowed existing laws and institutions to continue functioning. He preserved Solon's legal framework, administering it from above rather than dismantling it. Pisistratus ruled in three distinct phases, marked by temporary exiles and returns, but he ultimately established a stable tyranny that lasted for over 30 years. During his rule, archons continued to be elected, but their role became symbolic. Major decisions were rooted through the tyrant's court. The Areopagus Council, a conservative stronghold of former archons, was left intact but neutered. The assembly met, but under watchful eyes. State revenues, drawn in part from tribute and agricultural production, were used for public projects: roads, temples, and most famously, the initiation of the Greater Panathenaea, a festival that fused religion, politics, and civic pride. Pisistratus' genius was in retaining the forms of bureaucracy while filling them with his own authority. The institutional quiet beneath tyranny. Even under tyranny, Athenian institutions functioned. The archon eponymous still lent his name to each year. Legal disputes were still filed and adjudicated. Rituals overseen by the archon Basilius continued uninterrupted. The polemarch assumed new responsibilities, particularly over the growing population of metics, non-citizen residents essential to Athens' economy. Though real power lay with Pisistratus and later his sons, the continued operation of these offices preserved a sense of continuity. Unlike in cities where tyranny dismantled traditional governance, Athens experienced a kind of administrative stasis. This meant that when the tyranny ended, the city still had usable frameworks for civic participation. It was bureaucracy that kept democracy possible. The fall of the tyrants and the constitutional vacuum. After Pisistratus' death in 528-7 BCE, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited power. Their rule lacked the founder's charisma and tolerance. When Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BCE, Hippias grew increasingly repressive. This opened the door to exile, assassination plots, and most fatefully Spartan intervention. In 510 BCE, with Spartan help, the tyranny was overthrown, and Athens was left with a political vacuum. The question now was not whether the archons would return; they had never left, but what form their role would take in a city suddenly conscious of its own political potential. Cleisthenes' Isagoras, and the last battle for the archonship. In the wake of Hippias' ousting, two men emerged as rivals for control. Isagoras, an aristocrat with conservative backing. Cleisthenes, a reform-minded noble from the Alcmeonid family. Both sought the archonship as a path to legitimacy. Isagoras secured the position and attempted to rule with Spartan support, expelling hundreds of citizens. Cleisthenes, backed by the Athenian demos, returned and reclaimed the city, leading to his pivotal reforms in 587 BCE. And so, the archonship, once a crown for elites, became a battleground for the soul of the polis. Bureaucratic survival and democratic transformation. Cleisthenes' reforms did not abolish the archonship, but they relocated its meaning. Selection by lot replaced election, beginning in the late 6th century. The archonship became accessible to a broader pool of citizens, though only gradually. Real decision-making shifted to the assembly, now empowered by new tribal divisions and expanded councils. The Bull Council of 500 took on daily governance responsibilities. Archons still presided over courts, rituals, and official duties, but the political initiative moved away from them. The archonship survived not because it changed, but because it was already administrative. Its stability made it reliable, even in times of political upheaval. Reflection, the hidden engine of civic evolution. In the grand story of Athenian democracy, the archons rarely take center stage. They were not revolutionaries. They were not visionaries. They were record keepers, festival organizers, and mediators of ritual and law. But they did something remarkable. They kept the city running. Even under aristocracy, even under tyranny, even through reform and revolution, the archons preserved a rhythm of governance, a way of living within systems that others could later transform. And when democracy came, it did not need to start from scratch. It had a bureaucracy waiting, already broken into parts, already familiar with limitation, already ordinary. The archons remind us that before power can be shared, it must first be defined, measured, and managed. By the early 5th century BCE, Athens had become a democracy in both name and function. With Cleisthenes' reforms, power was no longer anchored to a privileged few, but restructured through new tribes, councils, and a dramatically expanded assembly, ecclesia. And yet the archonship remained. Once the pinnacle of aristocratic privilege, the archons now found themselves occupying a strange space, not leaders, but facilitators, not policymakers, but administrators. Their power had been diluted, their selection process randomized, their scope reframed within a society that now increasingly delegated authority to the many. But this was not extinction, it was evolution. The archons were not relics. They were institutional survivors refined, reframed, and embedded into a radically different system. This final section explores what it meant to be an archon in a city that had outgrown aristocracy, and how bureaucracy proved more durable than revolution. The democratization of selection, archons by lot. One of the most revolutionary changes in democratic Athens was the use of lot sortition to assign public office. From around 487 BCE, archons were no longer elected, but chosen by lot from a pool of eligible citizens. Eligibility was initially limited to the top 3 property classes, as defined by Solon, but over time this expanded. The lottery system symbolized egalitarianism. It wasn't wisdom, lineage, or charisma that earned you office, but citizenship and chance. This reform neutralized the archonship as a vehicle for aristocratic ambition. The office could no longer be monopolized. It became accessible, even mundane. The result, archons no longer ruled but performed vital functions within the democratic machine. Archon roles in the democratic era. Each of the 9 archons retained a specific set of duties, many of which remained tied to ritual, law, and record-keeping. Their work was necessary but increasingly invisible in the political sphere. Let's revisit their roles under democracy. 1. Archon eponymous. Still the titular head of the year, this archon was now mostly a civic manager. Presided over family law, including inheritance and guardianship cases. Managed citizen registration, and oversaw name inscriptions of public decisions, had jurisdiction over some civil suits, especially involving family disputes. Despite being symbolic, the position retained ceremonial weight. The public calendar still bore his name, linking bureaucracy to time itself. 2. Archon Basilius. The religious archon retained authority over sacred rituals, festivals, and ancestral rites. Sacrilege trials, including those involving impiety, asabea. Oversight of major religious festivals, such as the Eleusinian Mysteries, and rites honoring the Eumenides. The Basilius ensured ritual continuity, functioning as a bridge between state and sacred custom. 3. Polemarch. Once the city's war leader, the polemarch's role had become primarily ceremonial and judicial. Supervised medics resident aliens handling disputes, registrations, and rights of appeal. Presided over funerary rites for fallen soldiers, maintaining the dignity of military tradition. May have acted as a figurehead in parades or public ceremonies, invoking Athens' martial heritage. The actual military leadership now lay with the strategoi generals, elected separately. 4. 6. The Smothetai. The least famous archons, but perhaps the most functional, managed the judicial calendar, scheduling cases for the Heliaea popular courts, maintained legal archives, ensured consistency of verdicts, and assisted with jury selection. Sat as a bench of 6 in major trials, acting as co-judges or procedural overseers. Their work was crucial to keeping the legal system running. Without them, Athens' democratic justice would collapse into chaos. The Archons and the Areopagus Council. Although the Archons' active powers declined, they retained post office influence through the Areopagus Council. Upon completing their term, former Archons automatically joined this ancient body. The Areopagus, once dominant, now served as a judicial and moral advisory council. It dealt with homicide cases, serious religious offenses, and sometimes investigations into public misconduct. This system created a cadre of experienced citizens, available for consultation, but largely separated from daily politics. The archonship, then, became a kind of civic training ground, a year of service followed by lifetime inclusion in a body of elder statesmen. The bureaucracy beneath the democracy. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had hundreds of magistrates, officials, and clerks, all part of the democratic bureaucracy. Archons coordinated courts, but jurors were chosen by lot from the dikastai jury pool. Strategoi led armies, often with real political influence, unlike the now passive polemarch. Treasurers, inspectors, record keepers, and market officials filled other roles, many chosen by lot, some by election. In this sea of public offices, the archons became anchors of continuity. They knew the rituals, they had procedural knowledge, they kept things moving. In a system that rotated power constantly, institutional memory mattered. And archons, by their structure, provided that. Rituals, festivals, and political theater. Athens was not just a political system, it was a performance. Every year was filled with festivals, public games, dramatic contests, and sacred rituals. The archons were key coordinators in these events. The archon eponymous organized the Dionysia, a dramatic and religious festival where plays were performed for thousands. The archon Basilius ensured the proper sacrifice was made to ancient gods before and after major civic events. The polemarch presided over military commemorations and honored the dead. In these roles, archons ensured public rituals were linked to civic identity. They upheld the appearance of order, reinforcing the myth that Athens was not only democratic but sacred. The decline of prestige, not function. By the end of the 5th century BCE, few citizens aspired to the archonship for glory. The job had become too procedural. The power had moved elsewhere to orators, generals, and the assembly itself. But the need for the archonship remained. Even in times of war, oligarchic coup, or democratic crisis, Athens rarely dismantled its bureaucratic backbone. The archons kept track of time, of law, of names. They opened ceremonies. They certified legal verdicts. They processed citizenships and oversaw trials. If the assembly was the heart of democracy, and the courts its voice, then the archons were its circulatory system, pumping documents, rituals, and cases through a city that had become more complex than any one person could manage. Reflection: bureaucratic legacy in the age of popular power. We often romanticize Athens as a city of debate and idealism, but its survival and much of its brilliance lay in the mundane. The archonship teaches us that institutions outlive ideologies. Under monarchy, they emerged as tools of consolidation. Under aristocracy, they functioned as instruments of elite control. Under tyranny, they became masks of stability. Under democracy, they evolved into organs of administration. And through each phase, they endured not because they were powerful, but because they were useful. The Athenian archons remind us that before history is made on the battlefield or the speaker's platform, it is usually typed, tallied, and quietly notarized in triplicate. Story 5. The Agora and the Assembly Spaces of Civic Life. The Agora. To modern ears, it sounds like a plaza, a town square, a place where people milled about under the sun. And in many ways it was. But for ancient Athenians and for the broader Greek world, the Agora was far more than a marketplace. It was the beating heart of the polis, a civic, commercial, judicial, and religious center. It was where politics breathed, where law spoke, and where the public eye watched. Yet the Agora did not arrive fully formed. Its development was a slow, deliberate emergence, not a revolutionary act. Before it ever hosted debates or trials, it hosted vendors. Before it was marked by stoas and statues, it was a clearing. Before it became a symbol of democracy, it was simply a space open, flat, and full of potential. This section traces the Agora from its earliest incarnations in archaic Greece to its establishment as Athens' civic core, a process that was as much social engineering as it was urban planning. Before the Agora, early settlements and informal spaces. In the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Greek communities were scattered and organized around kinship. There were no formal cities, just clusters of families, homesteads, and sanctuaries. What little communal life existed happened in open spaces, near shrines, or at crossroads where trade and religion met. These early communal areas weren't designed. They emerged organically. They often stood near religious altars, where sacrifices united groups. Others formed near natural springs, for practical as well as sacred reasons. Sometimes they appeared where paths converged, accidental but useful. In these spaces, custom was king. There were no written laws, no political institutions, just agreements reinforced by tradition and reputation. And yet, these proto-agoras were essential in nurturing a public consciousness. They were places where you saw others and, more importantly, were seen. The rise of polis and the need for central spaces. By the 7th century BCE, the Greek world experienced a transformation, the rise of the polis. These city-states, independent, self-governing, and fiercely localized, required formal spaces for civic life. A polis was not simply a city. It was a community with laws, identity, and ritual, and each one needed a place for deliberation and decision-making, a location to exchange goods and services, a center for religious festivals and sacrifices, an area to display laws, decrees, and statutes, a place where citizens could gather, linger, and observe. The Agora answered these needs. Gradually, what had once been loosely organized open ground became structured, curated space, often situated at the geographical or symbolic center of the city. The Agora of Athens, foundations of a civic symbol. Athens' Agora likely began as a market and public area just northwest of the Acropolis. By the 6th century BCE, under Solon, it had begun to take shape as a more ordered civic space. Roads converged here, drawing farmers, traders, and pilgrims. Sacred sites, such as the altar of the 12 gods, gave it religious weight. Slowly, officials began operating in the Agora, resolving disputes, recording decisions, and announcing edicts. Yet the Agora remained messy, both literally and politically. Vendors lined the pathways. Philosophers, musicians, and itinerant performers shared the space with butchers and cobblers. There was little architectural uniformity. Most buildings were temporary stalls or open-air platforms. This openness, both physical and ideological, was crucial. In contrast to the closed courtyards of aristocratic homes or elite sanctuaries, the Agora was available to the citizenry, and that made it powerful. The Agora as a stage for the citizen. Athenian life was intensely public. From the 5th century onward, the notion of citizenship came with duties performed in view of others. Attending assembly meetings, serving as jurors, participating in festivals or sacrifices, engaging in public debates or hearings. And the Agora was where these performances occurred. Politicians delivered speeches near the monument of the eponymous heroes, a notice board for public announcements. Litigants prepared for trials by conferring in colonnades or beneath olive trees. Artists and poets previewed works. Philosophers like Socrates wandered through, asking questions, stirring conversations. In all of this, the Agora trained the citizen to be a participant. You couldn't avoid politics if you walked through the Agora. It was literally in the way. The architecture of assembly, stoas and statues. Over time, Athens formalized its Agora with permanent structures that reinforced its civic role. Stoa Basileus, Royal Stoa, a place for officials and court activity. Stoa Poikel, painted stoa. Adorned with murals depicting battles and myths, it doubled as a civic art gallery and gathering place. Tholos, a circular building used by the Prytanes, a group of 50 citizens from the Boule who were on-call administrators. Bouleuterion, meeting hall for the Council of 500, the executive branch of democracy. In these buildings, everyday life and governance intersected. One could buy sandals in the morning, overhear a legal trial at midday, and witness a democratic vote by sunset. The proximity of commerce, ritual, and politics made the Agora a lens for understanding the polis itself. Ritual, sacrifices, and civic identity. The Agora was not merely secular. On the contrary, it was surrounded by temples, shrines, and sacred trees. The altar of the 12 gods served as a religious marker, and the geographical center for measuring distances across Attica. Statues of gods Zeus, Athena, Hermes stood beside those of mortal heroes and political figures. Sacrifices and processions began or ended in the Agora, reinforcing its role as a ritual space. These intersections mattered. They reminded Athenians that being a citizen was not just a legal status, it was a sacred one, reinforced by ritual and overseen by the gods. Even administrative documents were often placed beside or beneath religious monuments, merging law and divinity in plain sight. The marketplace of justice and commerce. Justice in Athens was a public affair. Legal disputes unfolded in and around the Agora. Magistrates, known as archons and the smothetai, held preliminary hearings at designated spots. Public trials drew spectators and were often conducted in open-air courts, surrounded by curious citizens. Disputes over contracts, property, or inheritance might be overheard by vendors selling fruit or tools. Likewise, commerce was highly regulated in this space. Prices were monitored. Measures were standardized. Inspectors ensured that weights were fair and grain pure. In many ways, the Agora embodied a civic morality, a place where private gain was always under public scrutiny. A place to be seen. The Greek word agorazin means not just to shop, but also to speak in public. To go to the agora was to enter society. Clothing, body language, tone of voice, these were all performances. Athenian democracy didn't just demand a vote, it demanded presence. You had to show up, you had to be seen and heard. This created an environment of informal accountability. Citizens who abused power or ignored their duties might be shamed, gossiped about, or even legally prosecuted through ostracism, a process that began with voting in the agora. The agora as the mind of the polis. By the classical period, the Athenian agora was more than a space, it was an idea. It was where citizenship was expressed, where laws were visible, not just remembered, where identity was formed not in isolation, but in shared rituals, words, and transactions. It was messy, noisy, uneven, and that made it alive. Athens did not invent the agora, but it refined it, showing the world how a city could govern itself through space by placing the citizen in constant contact with others. But if the agora was the stage of civic life, then the assembly, ecclesia, was the main event, the dramatic performance of lawmaking, where citizens shaped their world with raised hands and measured words. And so, one must ask, how did an open hillside outside the city become the most powerful legislative body in the Greek world? While the agora throbbed with daily life laws posted, disputes argued, sandals sold, and fig wine poured, another space loomed in the minds of Athenian citizens, the ecclesia, or assembly. If the agora was the pulse of Athens, the ecclesia was its voice. But this voice didn't begin as a roar. It began as a murmur, slowly gathering volume across generations. From its hazy origins as an advisory council to kings, the ecclesia grew into the primary legislative body of the world's first radical democracy. It wasn't majestic in its setting, just a rocky hillside called the Pnyx. There were no marble columns or gold-plated thrones, just wooden benches or stone seats and the sky above. And yet it was here that citizens assembled not to be ruled, but to rule themselves. The early roots, assembly before democracy. Long before the ecclesia became the instrument of Athenian democracy, its function was rudimentary, a gathering of male citizens to hear announcements or ratify decisions made by kings or aristocrats. In Homeric poems, such gatherings existed, but only as performative consultations. Kings like Agamemnon might listen to elders or warriors, but decision-making remained in elite hands. Even in archaic Athens, 8th–7th centuries BCE, the assembly likely functioned as an occasional consultative body, summoned by archons or the Areopagus Council. Its authority was symbolic ritual, not rule. Yet even this early form mattered. It kept alive the idea that citizenship involved showing up. It created the habit of public attendance, even if power still resided in the few. Solon's first steps toward a participatory polis. In the early 6th century BCE, Solon's reforms, c. 594 BCE, marked a turning point.